I was standing near the entrance to the main hall, trying to find my place in the middle of that sea of fancy people, when the wedding coordinator came over. She had that professional little smile that never quite reaches the eyes, you know? And right behind her, my daughter-in-law, Kimberly, with a smile that was just pure ice. The coordinator then said, almost in a whisper, like she was telling me some shameful secret, "Mrs. Coleman, your seat is in row 15, next to the service area." Before I could even process what that meant, Kimberly leaned in and added, her voice low and sharp, so only I could hear, "My family will be embarrassed if your simplicity is too obvious." I felt a chill go right up my spine, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of me. My son, Anthony, my only son, was just a few feet away, talking to one of the groomsmen. He heard every word. I saw it in his shoulders, how they slumped just a tiny bit. He just lowered his head, staring down at the expensive Italian leather shoes that I knew he hadn't paid for himself. No defense, not a single word, not one look in my direction to give me an ounce of comfort. In that glittering hall, among the sound of violins and the clinking of champagne glasses, I, the mother of the groom, was basically told my place was with the trash. 11 years a widow, 41 years dedicated to raising that boy, and all I was worth in that hall was a seat in the back, behind even the photographers and the flower arrangers. But for you to understand how things got to this ridiculous point, to this level of quiet cruelty, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Angela Coleman, I'm 67 years old, and until 4 years ago, I'd been a widow for 7. My David was gone, and he took a piece of me with him. For over 41 years, I taught English literature at a public school in Southeast Washington, D.C., a career I am immensely proud of. No, I'm not rich like Kimberly's parents. Never have been. But I live comfortably on my pension and in the small house that my husband and I bought with our own hard-earned money, brick by brick. Until that Saturday, June 22nd, 2024, I thought I'd made my peace with being alone. But there, at my son's luxurious wedding, I finally understood. The real loneliness isn't the absence of those who've passed. It's when the people who are still alive deny you basic respect, treat you like you're already dead and buried. I didn't cry. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I took a deep breath, felt the cold air from the AC fill my lungs. I lifted my chin, straightened my navy blue dress, simple, clean, but obviously worn next to the designer gowns parading around. And I walked to that back row like I was marching to my throne. Every step was a small victory against the urge to just run out of there. The ceremony was at a historic estate in Potomac, Maryland, a massive place with perfectly manicured gardens and a ballroom that looked like it was straight out of a period film. It belonged to Kimberly's family, of course, the Montgomerys, a family that never made any secret of the fact that I didn't belong in their world. Everything was so over the top it was almost numbing. The flower arrangements lining the aisle surely cost more than my entire monthly salary. I felt like a cheap paint smudge on a priceless canvas. As I walked past the front rows, I saw Kimberly's mother, Dolores, sitting like a queen, surrounded by her high society friends. They wore pearl necklaces that gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and their eyes followed me with a cruel curiosity. I clearly heard one of them whisper to another, covering her mouth with a fan, "Is that the groom's mother? I heard she taught in a public school. It must be so hard for her to be in a place like this." The other one answered with a stifled little laugh. I finally reached row 15. It was exactly as described. The very last one, squeezed between the film crew and a slightly ajar door from which came the hum of a generator and the smell of food being prepped. The metal chair was cold against my back. I sat down, keeping my posture straight, a lesson I'd taught thousands of students that was now serving to hold me up. I looked toward the altar, toward my son. Anthony looked different in that tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a rehearsed smile on his face. He looked like a polished, empty version of the boy I raised. Where was my boy? The one who used to bring me wildflowers and tell me I was the most beautiful woman in the world? The one who, when his father died, hugged me and said, "It's just us now, Mom, and I'll never leave you." He was there, but at the same time, he wasn't. The wedding march started to play and Kimberly came in. She was stunning, I can't deny it. A dress that probably cost as much as a car. But she walked down the aisle without even a glance in my direction. To her, I was a shadow, an inconvenient detail she wanted to erase from the perfect picture of her perfect day. I was resigned to spending the rest of the ceremony there, invisible and forgotten. That's when the chair next to me creaked. A man sat down. I didn't pay attention at first, keeping my eyes fixed on the altar, but I smelled an expensive but subtle cologne, a mix of bergamot and sandalwood. I glanced sideways. He was older, maybe in his early 70s, with well-cut silver hair. He was wearing an impeccable black suit and a Swiss watch that glinted discreetly on his wrist. He didn't look like a photographer or a staff member. He looked important. He leaned in, and his voice was low and steady, a balm in the midst of so much superficial noise. "Let's pretend we came together." I turned, surprised, and then he placed his hand over mine, which was resting and trembling in my lap. The warmth of his hand was solid, real, and strangely comforting. He looked forward, toward the altar, as if nothing had happened, but his presence next to me changed everything. I felt the curious gazes from the guests in the rows ahead turn our way. I saw the whispers change their tone. Pity turned to questions. I turned all the way, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath caught in my throat, and I looked at his face. There was something familiar in those deep blue eyes, in the curve of his subtle smile. Who was this man? That man's hand on mine was a warm, firm weight. For a second, my instinct was to pull away, to shrink back. A lifetime of being discreet, of not drawing attention, had taught me to retreat. But then, the image of Kimberly's cold smile and my son's bowed head flashed in my mind. And I didn't pull away. On the contrary, my fingers, which had been trembling, relaxed under his touch. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture. But for me, it was like an anchor had been dropped in the middle of a storm. The music from the violin shifted, and the minister began to speak. His words about love, union, and partnership were a distant hum. My entire focus was right there, in that chair beside me. I wasn't looking at the man, but I could feel him. His presence was like a shield. The whispers behind us had stopped. Curiosity was stronger than contempt. I could feel the stares, no longer of pity, but of intrigue. Who was that man in the expensive suit sitting in the back row with me? What was he doing here? The dynamic of the room had shifted. I was no longer the poor thing, the public school teacher mom. I was the woman accompanied by someone who, clearly, did not belong in row 15. I glanced at the altar. Anthony, who should have been focused on his bride, flickered his eyes toward the back. His gaze passed over me and stopped on the man beside me. I saw the color drain from his face. He went pale, his mouth slightly agape. Kimberly noticed his distraction, followed his gaze, and her face, which was already a mask of cold perfection, hardened even more. Her smile became stretched, a thin, tight line. Good. For the first time that day, I felt a spark of something that wasn't humiliation. It was power. The man beside me, as if reading my thoughts, murmured softly without moving his head, "Now they don't know where to put you in their picture anymore." The ceremony went on, and I got lost in thought. I tried to concentrate, but the profile of that man, silhouetted against the soft light coming through one of the high windows, pulled me back to a place I had kept locked away in my memory. 51 years. It had been 51 years. I closed my eyes for a second, and the smell of cut grass and magnolias from the estate's garden faded away. Suddenly, I was back in the summer of 1973. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick and humid. The sound of cicadas was the soundtrack to every day. I was 16 years old with the whole world ahead of me, and he was there, Theodore, but I called him Theo. He was a year older, worked at his uncle's record shop, and had the same deep blue eyes and the same quiet smile. He didn't have silver hair, but a thick, unruly, dark brown mop that fell over his forehead. We'd spend the summer afternoons sitting on my front porch, drinking soda from the bottle and listening to Marvin Gaye on the radio. He'd tell me about his dreams of traveling the world, of building an empire. I'd laugh and tell him about mine, of teaching, of reading every book ever written. He'd hold my hand, and it was unlike anything else. It was electric, full of promise. He was my first love, the kind of love you think will last forever. That summer, he told me he'd been accepted into a business program in Paris. Paris. It seemed like another planet. He promised he would write every day. "I'll come back for you, Angela. I'll always come back for you," he said the night he left, on the same porch where our dreams had mingled. I waited. Oh, how I waited. The weeks turned into months. Not one letter arrived. My 16-year-old heart broke, piece by piece. My mother, who never approved of Theo, a dreamer without a penny to his name, she'd say, consoled me with practical advice. "Men like that come and go, Angela. You need someone stable, someone with his feet on the ground." And that's when David came into my life. A good, kind, stable man. The opposite of Theo. I married David, we had Anthony, we built a life. A good, loving life. But without that spark, without the electricity I felt in the summer of '73, I buried Theo, along with the pain and the letters that never came. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. The minister's voice brought me back to the present with a jolt. The hall was silent. I looked at Kimberly and Anthony at the altar. A transaction. That's what their marriage looked like. The merging of two families, two reputations, two fortunes. Love seemed like a secondary detail, just like me. "You may kiss the bride." The guests applauded. The sound of clapping echoed through the hall. People started to get up. The man beside me slowly removed his hand from mine, and I felt the loss of its warmth. He stood up, and I did too. And then he turned to me, looking me in the eye for the first time. The world seemed to spin. The blue eyes were the same, older, with little lines at the corners, but they held the same intensity I remembered. The quiet smile widened just a bit, a nostalgic smile, full of unasked questions. He seemed to be truly seeing me, not the 67-year-old woman in a simple dress, but the 16-year-old Angela he'd left behind. He said, his voice still low, but crystal clear in the middle of the hubbub, "We meet again, Angela." My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. The name, which I hadn't said out loud in 51 years, escaped my lips in a whisper that could barely be heard. Theodore. His name, Theodore, hung in the air between us, a fragile, ancient word in the middle of the party's noise. He smiled, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of 5 decades. "Call me Theo, Angela, like you used to." Theo. A name I had pushed to the darkest corner of my memory. Hearing that nickname again, in his voice, was like finding a yellowed photograph you thought you'd lost in a fire. For an instant, the ballroom, the guests, the humiliation, it all vanished. It was just the two of us, and time was a confusing, tangled line. He offered his hand, not to touch me, but as an invitation. "Let's take a walk, Angela. Away from all this." I nodded, unable to form a complete sentence. He led me out of the ballroom through a side door that opened onto the estate's gardens. The June evening air was warm and fragrant with the scent of roses and jasmine. The sound of the orchestra grew muffled, a distant melody. Our feet made a soft crunching sound on the gravel path. We walked in silence for a few moments. I was trying to gather my thoughts, but it was like trying to catch smoke with my hands. Him, the ghost of my first love, was here, in the flesh. Older, his once brown hair now completely silver, but his posture was the same quiet confidence. He stopped near a stone bench under an old oak tree. "Are you okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "I don't know what I am," I answered, my voice a little shaky. I thought you had vanished." He sat on the bench and looked up at me. "I thought you had vanished too, Angela, but I never stopped looking." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I saw what they did to you in there, with your seat. That's why I came over. I couldn't watch that and do nothing." His kindness, after so much cruelty, almost made me break down. But I held on. There was one question that had been burning in my throat for 51 years. "Why did you never write, Theo? You promised." The question came out harsher than I intended, loaded with all the pain of an abandoned teenager. He didn't flinch. Instead, a look of profound sadness crossed his face. But I did write, Angela, he said, his voice low and serious. I wrote dozens of letters. Every week, for the first 6 months in Paris. I used that light blue stationery we bought together at Mr. Henderson's paper shop. I'd walk to the post office near my apartment on the Rue de Rivoli, and I'd mail every single one, imagining your face as you read them. I stared at him, confused. What was he even saying? I never got anything. Not one letter, not a postcard, nothing. He closed his eyes for a moment. I know. After a year with no reply, I scraped together all the money I had, and I called your house. An international call, which was a fortune back then. Your mother answered. My mother. The blood ran cold in my veins. I remembered her, always telling me Theo was a dreamer, that he'd forget me as soon as he got on the plane. Theo went on. She was very polite, said you were doing well, that you were happy, that you'd met a good boy from a hard-working family, and that you were talking about getting engaged. She told me, in no uncertain terms, Angela, that you'd asked me not to contact you anymore, that you wanted to move on. The air left my lungs. I felt my legs give way, and I sat down next to him on the stone bench. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. My mother, she didn't just hide the letters. She lied. She built a wall between us, brick by brick, to secure the stable future she so desperately wanted for me. I can't believe it, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I believed it, Theo said, his voice hoarse. I was an 18-year-old kid, insecure, on the other side of the world, and I loved you enough to respect what I thought was your wish. He looked down at his own hands. I never married Angela. I tried a few times, but I always compared. None of them were you. He told me he came back to the States years later, built his company from the ground up. He said that every now and then he'd look up my name. He saw I'd become a teacher. He read about the awards I'd won for my work with the youth of D.C. He knew David had passed away. I'm sorry about your husband, he said sincerely. He seemed like a good man. He was, I answered, the tears finally wanting to come. He was a wonderful husband and a father I wish was here today. Our conversation, suspended in time, was brutally interrupted. Mom! Anthony's voice reached us. He and Kimberly were standing at the start of the gravel path, their silhouettes cut out against the golden light spilling from the ballroom. Kimberly had a furious expression on her face. What are you doing out here? People are asking for you, she said, her voice full of accusation, as if I were a child who'd run away from the party. And then her gaze fell on Theo, and her face twisted into a mask of contempt. And who are you? Theo stood up, calm and imposing. My name is Theodore Sterling, and I was keeping Mrs. Coleman company, since her son and daughter-in-law put her at a seat where she'd have no company at all. Anthony turned red. Theo, please. It wasn't like that. It was a mistake by the staff. I stood up too, feeling a new strength flowing through me. The pain from the revelation about my mother mixed with the anger of the present humiliation. Was it a mistake, son? I asked, my voice steady. Or was it an order? Be a man for once in your life and tell me the truth. He couldn't look at me. Kimberly stepped forward, protective and aggressive. Look, I don't know who you think you are, she said, addressing Theo, but this is a family event, and we have a reputation to uphold. We don't need strangers causing trouble. Reputation. That word again. Theo gave a thin, almost imperceptible smile. He adjusted the lapel of his jacket. Miss Montgomery, or should I say, Mrs. Coleman, he began, his voice polished and dangerously calm. Reputation is a very interesting thing. Fragile, I'd say. He paused, letting the tension build. My name, as I said, is Theodore Sterling. I'm the founder and CEO of Sterling Capital. I saw a flicker of recognition and panic in Kimberly's eyes. Her family's company, Montgomery Realty, was big in Potomac, but Sterling Capital was a giant in the D.C. financial world. Theo then delivered the final blow with the same ease as someone commenting on the weather. Sterling Capital, as it happens, finalized the acquisition of the commercial building on K Street, where your family's real estate firm is headquartered, just last week. I believe the new lease agreement is sitting on your father's desk as we speak. The silence that followed was absolute. Kimberly's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure panic. Anthony looked from Theo to me, his mouth open as if he'd just seen a ghost. Kimberly stammered, her voice a thread. What? What did you say? Theo's revelation hung in the warm night air like a death sentence. Kimberly's jaw trembled slightly before she managed to close her mouth. The shock on her face was so raw, so genuine, that for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Anthony, for his part, seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. He was looking at me, then at Theo, his eyes wide with panic, like an animal caught in a trap. Their reputation, their carefully constructed house of cards, was teetering on the edge of a cliff. And who was at the top of that cliff? The public school teacher mom and her long-lost love from 50 years ago. The irony was so thick I could taste it, stronger than the cheap champagne they'd served in row 15. Theo didn't gloat. He simply maintained his calm posture, his steady gaze. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. His power was quiet, undeniable. He turned to me, completely ignoring the petrified couple. "Angela," he said, his voice soft again, as if we were alone. "If you'll let me, I'd like to take you to dinner, to a place where your seat will be the best in the house." It was an exit, a triumphant one. He offered me his arm. I looked at my son. Anthony opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He was paralyzed between the fear of losing his wife's empire and the shame of having abandoned his own mother. In that moment, he was neither a Coleman nor a Montgomery. He was just a coward. Without saying a word to them, I took Theo's arm. I felt the fine, expensive fabric of his jacket under my fingers. As we turned to leave, I heard Kimberly whisper Anthony's name, her voice sharp with panic. "Anthony, do something." But he did nothing, and we walked arm in arm down the gravel path, leaving them behind in the middle of their own wedding reception, alone with the consequences of their contempt. I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I was only looking forward. Theo's car was a black Mercedes, luxurious but understated. The driver opened the door for me, and I slid into the back seat, feeling the soft leather and the new car smell. It was a world so different from my old 2012 Honda Civic, with its scent of old books and the lavender sachet I used to cover up the smell of dust. Theo sat beside me and gave an address to the driver. "Fiola Mary, please, Charles." The restaurant was in Georgetown, with a breathtaking view of the Potomac River. As soon as we walked in, the maitre d' greeted us with a reverent smile. "Mr. Sterling, what a pleasure to have you. Your table is ready." He led us to the best table, right by a panoramic window that framed the city lights dancing on the dark water. The evening unfolded like a dream. We talked about everything and nothing. About the lost decades, about the lives we lived apart. I told him about my students, the hopeful, brilliant faces that had passed through my classroom. I talked about David, about what a good man he was, about how, in his final months, I would read him poems by Maya Angelou every night, because the voice of poetry seemed to soothe the pain the medicine no longer could. I talked about Anthony, about the bright, loving boy he had been, and the distant man he had become. I talked about the Sunday calls, always short, always superficial. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay? Great. Kimberly says hi. Bye." I didn't complain. I just reported. The ache in my voice was enough. My cell phone, which I'd put in my purse, started to vibrate, and vibrate again, and again. I knew who it was. Anthony, probably at the behest of Kimberly, who by now was in a full-blown panic. I ignored it. The insistent buzzing was a reminder of their world, a world of transactions and interests, and I didn't want it invading mine. Theo ordered dinner, and I smiled when I heard his order for me. And for the lady, the seafood risotto. It was the same dish I had ordered on our first and only fancy date back in 1973 at a little Italian place that was long gone. He remembered. After 51 years, he still remembered. "How could you possibly remember that?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled. "I remember everything about you, Angela." Sometime between the main course and dessert, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled my phone from my purse. There were 17 missed calls from Anthony and an avalanche of text messages. I opened the last one. "Mom, please, call me. Kimberly's a mess. She won't stop crying. Her father called. He's furious. They could lose the office, Mom. Her family could lose everything. Please, talk to that man." Lose everything. The words echoed in my head. Lose the office, the shame, the humiliation. It was their fear, the same kind of fear they tried to impose on me when they put me in that chair in the back. The fear of being diminished, of being seen as less. A wave of cold, clear anger washed over me. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger, but something calm, sharp as a shard of ice. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the building on K Street. My humiliation only started to matter when it started to cost them money and prestige. I looked at my reflection in the dark restaurant window. I saw a tired woman with wrinkles that told the story of a life of work, of loss, and of quiet loves. But I also saw a new spark in her eyes, a flame that had been lit that night. I took a deep breath, turned off my phone, and put it back in my purse, as deep as it would go. The buzzing stopped. The silence was wonderful. I looked over at Theo, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. I gave a small smile, the first genuine, powerful smile of the day. "Everything's great, Theo," I replied, my voice steady, without a hint of hesitation. "They're not putting me in the back row anymore, not anywhere." The 3 days that followed were strangely quiet, and yet full of internal noise. My cell phone stayed silent. Anthony didn't call again. It was a tactical silence, I knew. They were regrouping, planning their next move. And in that silence, I found myself again. Theo called me every day. Not to talk about Anthony or the Montgomerys, but to talk about us. We talked for hours, as if we were trying to fill the 51-year gap in just a few days. He told me about his business, his travels, the people he'd met. And I told him about my small life, which suddenly didn't feel so small anymore. I told him about the pride I felt seeing one of my students from one of the toughest parts of D.C. get into college. I told him about the peace I felt in my garden, tending to the roses David had planted. With every conversation, I felt a part of me that I didn't even know was dormant wake up. The 16-year-old Angela, the dreamer, the one who believed in sparks and electricity, was there, talking with the 67-year-old woman that life had made me. And for the first time, they didn't feel like two different people. On Wednesday afternoon, the silence was broken. I received an email. Not a call, not a text, but a formal email from Anthony. The subject line was, "Dinner invitation." The body of the email was polished, impersonal. "Mom, Kimberly and I would very much like for you to join us for dinner at Philomena in Georgetown this Friday at 7 p.m. We have much to discuss. With love, Anthony." Philomena. The most expensive, old-school Italian restaurant in Georgetown, the kind of place where politicians and lobbyists cut deals. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. A clear attempt to get me on their turf, to impress me with luxury, to put me in a position where I'd feel indebted. It was a trap, and the bait was my desire to reconcile with my son. My first instinct was to refuse, to send an equally cold email back saying I was unavailable. But then, the image of Theo came to mind, his calm and his strength. He wouldn't back down. He would walk into the lion's den and look them in the eye. And I wasn't going to back down either. I picked up the phone and called him. "Theo, I've received an invitation." I told him about the email. He listened in silence. When I was done, he said only, "They're trying to isolate you, Angela. Put you in an environment where they feel in control." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm going." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I said, "But I have one condition." On Friday night, I got ready with a care I hadn't taken in years. I put on a simple but elegant black dress I kept for special occasions. It was the dress I had worn for my last wedding anniversary with David. I wore the pearl necklace he'd given me, the only piece of truly valuable jewelry I owned. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman who made no apologies for who she was. I arrived at Philomena promptly at 7 p.m. The place was packed. The sound of conversations and silverware filled the air. The maitre d', a man in an impeccable suit, looked me up and down when I gave the name for the reservation. "Ah, yes, Coleman. Your table is ready." There was an almost imperceptible note of condescension in his voice, as if he knew I didn't belong there. He led me through the opulent dining room. I saw Anthony and Kimberly sitting at a corner table, a discreet spot. They stood up as I approached. Kimberly forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were slightly puffy. She wore a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. Anthony looked tense, his jaw tight. "Mom, you came. That's great," he said, his voice flat. I sat in the chair he pulled out for me. The waiter appeared immediately, offering water and the wine list. They were clearly trying to stage a normal family dinner. "So," Anthony began awkwardly, "how have you been?" "I've been wonderful, son," I replied, my voice calm and even. Kimberly cleared her throat. We were so worried about you, Angela. Leaving the party like that." "Worried?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "Is that the word you've chosen?" The awkward silence that followed was broken by someone arriving at our table. The maitre d', this time with an expression of nervousness and reverence. "Ladies, sir, my apologies. We have one more guest for your table." Anthony and Kimberly looked at each other, confused. "There must be some mistake," Anthony said. "It's just the three of us." The restaurant door opened again, letting in a gust of evening air. And then he walked in, Theo, impeccable in his dark suit, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. He moved through the restaurant with a natural authority that made heads turn. He wasn't looking for us. He knew exactly where we were. He stopped right beside our table. The horror on Kimberly's face was a work of art. Anthony's jaw dropped, literally. Theo looked at them, then at me, and gave that quiet, powerful smile of his. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Theo's appearance was like dropping a boulder into a frozen lake. The shattering shock spread across the table, visible on Anthony's and Kimberly's faces. The maitre d', sensing the shift in the atmosphere, and more importantly, recognizing Theo, scrambled to pull up a chair for him with an agility that bordered on desperation. Theo sat down beside me, positioning himself as a silent ally, a king on his chessboard. The dinner, which was already a farce, turned into a surreal play. Anthony, completely thrown off balance, could barely form a sentence. He kept looking from Theo to me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Kimberly, on the other hand, regained her composure faster. She was a fighter, I had to give her that. A fighter who used falsehood as her armor. She turned her brightest and fakest smile on Theo. "Mr. Sterling, what a surprise. We didn't know you'd be joining us. Anthony, darling, why didn't you tell me?" She patted my son's arm, a perfect performance of intimacy and complicity that none of us at the table were buying. Theo simply inclined his head. "Angela invited me. I thought it would be a good opportunity for all of us to talk." The word talk sounded more like negotiate. The waiter came to take our orders. Theo ordered an expensive wine, a 1998 Barolo, without even looking at the menu. Kimberly tried to make small talk about the wine, about the vintage, about Italy, in a pathetic attempt to find common ground, to show she belonged in that world. Theo answered with polite but disinterested monosyllables, keeping the focus of his attention on me. He asked me about my day, about a book I was reading, treating me like the most important person at the table. And with every gesture of his, I watched Kimberly wither just a little bit more. Finally, after the main courses were served, exorbitant dishes that no one seemed to have an appetite for, Kimberly set her silverware down with a delicate but calculated clink on her plate. It was time for business. She turned to me, her voice syrupy sweet, full of a manufactured concern. "Angela, about what happened at the wedding. I know things got off on the wrong foot. And about the building my father owns." She glanced at Theo, then back at me. "I was thinking, maybe you could speak with Mr. Sterling. Explain that it was all a big misunderstanding. The lease agreement his company proposed, it's impossible. It will bankrupt us. It's my family's business, Angela, my grandfather's legacy." There it was, the ask, wrapped in cheap sentimentality, but it was a business request, pure and simple. "Use your influence, mother-in-law. Save our empire." Before I could answer, Theo set his wineglass down on the table. The sound of the crystal against the white linen was the only noise for a second. Mrs. Coleman, he said, addressing Kimberly, but keeping his eyes on me. I run an investment firm worth billions of dollars. And I've learned one thing over the years. Business is built on respect, mutual respect. It's the most valuable currency there is. He paused, and then, finally, he turned his gaze, cold as steel, to Kimberly. And frankly, respect is something that seems to be in short supply at this table. From your side, at least. Kimberly's face flushed. I respect Angela. I love her. She's my husband's mother. Love? I repeated the word, my voice low. You love me? You love me? And you put me at a table next to the service area so you wouldn't embarrass your rich guests? Is that love, Kimberly? She seemed shocked that I had dared to confront her. She turned to me, her eyes welling up with crocodile tears. It was a mistake, Angela. I told you. The coordinator got it all wrong. I'm so sorry. I apologize. The words, I'm sorry, came out of her mouth, but they had no weight, no truth. They were just sounds to solve a problem. I leaned forward across the table, my voice no more than a whisper, but it cut through the air. I looked deep into her eyes, forcing her to meet my gaze. Let me ask you a question, Kimberly, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. She swallowed hard, her eyes wide. Are you sorry for what you did? Or are you sorry because now there are consequences for you? The silence that fell over the table was deafening. She was utterly speechless, her mouth half open, her face pale. I had exposed her. The truth of her shallowness was laid bare under the lights of the expensive restaurant. She had no answer, because the answer would condemn her. I leaned back in my chair. Her gaze fled from mine, seeking help from Anthony. But my son had his head down again, staring at his plate, just like at the wedding. A silent bystander to yet another humiliation. Except this time, I wasn't the one being humiliated. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I barely touched my food. As soon as was polite, Theo asked for the check. While he was signing, I stood up. Thank you for dinner, Anthony, Kimberly. It was enlightening. They said nothing. They just watched us leave. The next morning, a Saturday, I was in my garden, pruning David's roses, trying to process the night before. The smell of damp earth and flowers was calming. Around 10 o'clock, I heard an expensive car pull up in front of my house, a sound that didn't belong on my quiet street. I peeked through the window. It was a gleaming white Lexus, and the person who got out of the driver's seat made me drop my gardening shears on the lawn. Dolores, Kimberly's mother. She marched up my walkway with the determination of a general, wearing a beige suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe, and in her hand she carried a designer purse and a checkbook. I didn't even have time to get to the door. Dolores knocked with an arrogant insistence. 3 quick, sharp raps, as if she were summoning a servant. I opened the door, still with a bit of dirt on my hands. She looked me up and down, a slight curl of her nose at my gardening clothes and stained apron. Angela, she said, my name sounding like an unpleasant formality in her mouth. I don't have much time. May I come in? She didn't wait for an answer. She just swept past me into my living room. Her stiletto heels sank slightly into my old Persian rug, a wedding gift from my parents. She glanced around, at my shelves full of books, at the photos of David and a smiling young Anthony on the wall, and I could see the judgment in her eyes. To her, my home, my sanctuary, was just a small, modest, outdated place. Look, she began, turning to face me, her designer bag swinging on her arm. I heard about last night's dinner, and I'm here to resolve this, once and for all, woman to woman. I crossed my arms, waiting. Resolve what, Dolores? She let out an impatient sigh. All of this drama. Kimberly is a wreck. She made a mistake. She was unkind. I'll grant you that. She's young. Sometimes she doesn't think. But this entire reaction, bringing business into it, dragging that man into a family matter, it's disproportionate. Disproportionate? I repeated, the calmness in my voice disarming her more than any shout could. Your daughter publicly humiliated me on the most important day of my son's life. My son stood by and said nothing to defend me. And you think my reaction is disproportionate? She opened her purse and took out her checkbook and a gold pen. The gesture was so calculated, so offensive, I felt a wave of nausea. I'm not here to argue semantics, Angela. I'm here to be practical. She opened the checkbook on my old wooden sideboard. Kimberly told me about the problem with the building lease. I understand you feel slighted, and I understand that your friend, Sterling, is using this as leverage. She started writing in the check with a flourish. So, let's make this easy. I'm going to give you a gift. A gesture of goodwill, so we can forget this little incident. I watched, frozen, as she filled in the amount. $60,000. She wrote the number with a firmness that told me, to her, this was a trivial sum, the price of getting rid of a nuisance. $60,000, she said, tearing the check out with a crisp rip. She held it out to me. This should help with your expenses. Maybe you can take a vacation, buy some new clothes, and in return, you talk to your friend. You tell him to drop this nonsense with the contract, to leave my husband's business alone, and we all move on. I looked at the check in her hand. $60,000. It was more money than I'd seen in one place in a long time. It was almost a full year of my pension. For a second, the sheer size of the number hit me. I could redo the kitchen. I could travel. I could have a security I hadn't felt since David died. And then, a memory came to me, clear as day. It was a few years before David got sick. We were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. A neighbor of ours had gotten into some shady deal and made a lot of money, but lost the respect of the entire street. David just shook his head and said to me, Angela, never forget, you can lose money, you can lose a job, you can lose a car. All of that can be earned back, but your dignity, your good name, once you sell that, you can never buy it back. A person's worth doesn't have a price tag. David's voice echoed in my head. A person's worth doesn't have a price tag. I reached out and took the check from Dolores's hand. She smiled, a triumphant smile as if she'd just closed a deal. Good. I knew we could come to an understanding. Practical women, as I said. I held the check between my fingers. The paper was thin, almost weightless. I looked at the number, at her name signed at the bottom. And then I looked at Dolores, right in her eyes. You're right, Dolores. Let's resolve this. And with one slow, deliberate motion, I tore the check in half, and then in half again. I kept tearing, turning the $60,000 into a small pile of blue and white confetti. Her smile vanished. Her face went white, then red with fury. What? What do you think you're doing? Are you insane? I opened my hand and let the pieces of paper flutter to my living room floor, scattering across the rug she so despised. My dignity is not for sale, Dolores, I said, my voice quiet, but with a steel I didn't know I possessed. Not for 60,000, not for 600,000, not for 6 million. You underestimated me. You disrespected me. And now you're going to learn that some things don't have a price. I walked to my front door and opened it wide. Now please get out of my house. Dolores stared at me, her mouth agape in shock and outrage. She looked like a creature who had never been told no in her entire life. She opened her mouth to say something, but caught herself. With a snarl of rage, she grabbed her purse, spun on her heel, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I closed the door after her, locked it, and leaned against the cool wood, my heart pounding wildly. I was shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was from adrenaline, from power. I had just torn up $60,000. And I had never felt so rich in my life. As soon as the door closed and the sound of Dolores's Lexus screeching away from my quiet street faded, the adrenaline began to give way to an uncontrollable trembling. I sat down on my old velvet sofa, the same sofa where David and I had watched so many movies, and I stared at the scraps of the check scattered on the floor. $60,000. I had torn up the equivalent of a new car, a trip around the world. For a split second, a wave of panic hit me. What have I done? But then, the image of Dolores's shocked and furious face came back to me. Her arrogance, her certainty that her money could buy anything, including my silence and my submission. And the panic turned into something else, a deep, unshakable conviction. I had done the right thing. I had honored myself, and I had honored David's memory. I reached for the phone. My fingers were still trembling a bit as I dialed Theo's number. "Theo?" I said when he answered, my voice still a little unsteady. "Angela, did something happen? You don't sound right." I took a deep breath and told him everything. About Dolores's visit, the beige suit, the condescending look, the checkbook, and about the $60,000 check that was now in pieces on my rug. On the other end of the line, there was silence. For a moment, I was afraid he'd think I'd been reckless, emotional. But then he spoke, and his voice was a mixture of contained fury and immense pride. "Angela Coleman, you are the most incredible woman I have ever known." He paused. "They've declared war, and they have no idea who they're dealing with." He continued, "Be ready in an hour. I'm sending Charles to pick you up. There's someone I want you to meet." Exactly 1 hour later, Theo's black Mercedes pulled up to my house. Charles, the driver, opened the door for me with a respect I wasn't used to. The destination was a glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of DCS Financial District, the headquarters of Sterling Capital. The lobby was bigger than the entire first floor of my house. The marble floors gleamed, and the silence was broken only by the soft clicking of keyboards and business chatter. Theo met me by the elevators, and his smile when he saw me was warm and genuine. "You look stunning," he said, and I felt my cheeks flush. He took me to the top floor, to a conference room with a panoramic view of the city. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance. Seated at the massive mahogany table, a woman was reviewing some documents. She stood up as we entered. She was a black woman, maybe in her late 40s, tall, elegant, with an impeccable natural hairstyle and a gaze that seemed to see right through you. She radiated intelligence and power. "Angela, I'd like you to meet Kenya Bryant, my lead counsel and the sharpest mind I know," Theo said. "Kenya, this is Angela Coleman." Kenya held out her handshake firm and confident. "Mrs. Coleman, it's an honor. Theo told me what happened, both at the wedding and this morning." She looked at me with a mixture of empathy and indignation. What the Montgomery family did wasn't just rude. It was cruel, and what her mother did this morning was an attempt at coercion. Sitting in that room, with these two people treating me with such respect and gravity, was surreal. Me, the public school teacher, suddenly had one of the best lawyers in the city on my side. Kenya sat and invited us to do the same. She opened a folder on the table. Theo asked me to draw up a strategy, not just for the lease, but for the entire situation. What they did to you was an assault on your dignity. And the law, Mrs. Coleman, can sometimes be a very effective tool for restoring dignity. She laid out the plan. It wasn't just a new lease agreement. It was a legal work of art, a symphony of consequences. "Montgomery Realty will have 2 options, Kenya explained, her voice precise and sharp as a scalpel. Option A, they can terminate their current lease. However, the penalty for breaking the contract, which is perfectly legal, is a sum that our analysis shows would bankrupt them in under 6 months. They'd have to sell off properties, lay off half their staff. It would be the end of grandfather's legacy, as Mrs. Montgomery put it." I swallowed hard. The severity of it was daunting. "Or," Kenya continued, "they can choose option B, sign a new 10-year lease agreement, an agreement with strict, non-negotiable terms." She began to detail the terms. The rent would be adjusted to current market value, an increase of nearly 40%. There would be quarterly audits. But the genius part wasn't in the numbers. It was in the other clauses. Clause 7.3, Kenya said, reading from the document. "Montgomery Realty commits to issuing a public and formal apology to Mrs. Angela Coleman for the humiliation and disrespect suffered. This apology must be delivered by Mrs. Kimberly Montgomery Coleman during the upcoming Potomac Foundation Charity Gala in front of all her peers." My eyes widened. Clause 8.1. The company commits to an annual donation of $25,000 to the Golden Years Foundation, a nonprofit that supports elderly individuals in vulnerable situations in Washington, D.C. And then she got to the final clause. She looked at me with a small smile. And my personal favorite, Clause 9. Montgomery Realty will establish and perpetually fund the David Coleman Memorial Scholarship, a scholarship in the amount of $12,000 annually. designated for a low-income student from a DC public school who wishes to study architecture in college. Exactly the career your late husband pursued. The tears I'd been holding back all morning finally came. They streamed hot down my face. A scholarship in my David's name. His dream had always been to help other young people build, to create. And now, the arrogance of Kimberly's family was going to fund that dream. It was redemption. It was poetry. It was perfect justice. Kenya passed me a box of tissues. We're not just charging them higher rent, Mrs. Coleman. We're charging them the price of respect. And it's steep. Theo put his hand on my shoulder. The decision is yours, Angela. We only move forward if you are 100% on board with this. I dried my tears, took the pen Kenya offered me, and looked at the line at the bottom of the document authorizing them to send the proposal. I remembered the cold chair in row 15. I remembered the torn check on my floor. I remembered my son's bowed head, and I signed. Signing that paper felt like I wasn't just sealing a deal, but a new chapter of my life. I left the Sterling Capital office feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in years, as if an invisible weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders had finally been lifted. Theo dropped me off at home, and the quiet of my street, the familiar scent of my roses, had never felt so welcoming. The next morning, a Monday, Kenya Bryant made her move. The document, a thick, intimidating package tied with a red ribbon, wasn't emailed. It was hand-delivered by a professional courier directly to the front desk of Montgomery Realty on K Street. I can just picture the scene, the heavy envelope landing on the polished marble desk, the sender's name, Bryant and Sterling Legal, sending a shiver down the receptionist's spine. The silence of the weekend was replaced by a hurricane. Theo called me late in the afternoon. "The bomb has dropped," he said, his voice serious but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. Kimberly's father, Robert Montgomery, called his lawyer, who happens to be an old acquaintance of mine. Apparently, Robert is inconsolable. He yelled, he threatened to sue, he called the contract extortion. But his lawyer, being a good lawyer, explained the hard reality. The contract is 100% legal and ironclad. They're trapped. The image of Robert Montgomery, a large, pompous man who had barely looked at me at the wedding, now inconsolable, didn't bring me joy. But it didn't bring me pity either. It brought a sense of balance, as if the scales of justice, which had been so lopsided, were starting to even out. I knew it was only a matter of time before the shockwave reached me. And it did. On Tuesday morning, my phone rang. The name Anthony flashed on the screen. My heart gave a painful lurch. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and answered. "Mom." His voice wasn't the voice of the distant son from the Sunday calls. It was the voice of a desperate man. "Yes, Anthony, what is it?" "Mom, what did you do?" he accused, his voice thick with panic and anger. "What did you people do? Kim's dad just called me. He's destroyed. You have no idea what that contract means. It's their ruin, the ruin of our family." Our family. The word hit me like a slap. I let him talk. He poured it all out, a rehearsed monologue of blame and victimhood. "I know we messed up, Mom, I know. But this is cruel. It's revenge. You're destroying my wife's family, their legacy. Dad would have never wanted this. He wasn't a vengeful person." The mention of David was a low blow, and it hurt. It hurt deeply. "Kimberly hasn't stopped crying for 2 days, he went on, his voice rising. "This is all because of that man, isn't it? Theo, he's known you for a few days and he's already put these ideas in your head. You're not like this, Mom. You're a good person. You've always taught forgiveness." I listened to every word, feeling a cold anger solidify inside me. When he finally stopped, breathless, waiting for my reaction, my surrender, I answered, and the voice that came out of me was one I didn't even recognize myself, calm, sharp, unshakable. "First, Anthony," I said slowly, "don't say you people. This was my decision. I sat in that room, I read every word of that document, and I signed the paper. Theodore gave me the tools and the power to choose, something you, my son, did not." He tried to interrupt, but I continued. "Second, and you listen to me good, do not dare use your father's memory against me. Your father valued dignity and respect above any amount of money. He would be ashamed, not of me, but of your silence. He would be ashamed to see his son watch his mother be humiliated and choose to do nothing so he wouldn't rock the boat. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "This is not revenge, son," I said, my voice a little softer, but still firm. "Revenge is an emotional, blind act. This is a lesson in consequences. Something your wife's family, who pride themselves on being in the world of business, should understand very well. Every action has a reaction. Every insult has a price." "But they're going to lose everything," he yelled, his voice breaking. "No, they're not," I replied. "They're going to pay fair rent. They're going to publicly apologize for a wrong they committed. And they are going to fund the dream of a young student in the name of the man whose memory you just tried to use to manipulate me. They aren't crying for my pain, Anthony. They are crying for the money and status they might lose. Their pain is in their wallet. Mine was in my soul. And my soul, son, is worth a hell of a lot more than an office on K Street." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. He was out of arguments. "I raised you for 41 years, Anthony. I loved you. I supported you. I defended you from everything and everyone. On your wedding day, when I needed just one look, one word from you, you turned your back on me, and you stayed silent. You chose their side. Now, the choice is yours again, and it's very simple." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. "Whose side are you on, Anthony? Your mother's side, the woman who gave you life and raised you on her own. Or the side of the family who not only humiliated me, but made you complicit in it? Mom, it's not like that. Don't ask me to choose," he stammered, his voice a plea. "I'm not asking." I cut him off, my patience gone. "Life is forcing you to. They have 48 hours to sign that contract, Anthony. 48 hours to decide if their pride is worth more than the empire they built." I took one last breath before delivering the final blow. "And you? You have the same amount of time to decide if you're still my son." And then, before he could answer, before I could second-guess myself, I hung up the phone. The final click echoed in the silence of my living room. And I just stood there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of it all. The future of my relationship with my only son was now on a 48-hour timer. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. Every tick-tock from the old grandfather clock in my living room felt like a hammer blow to my anxiety. I tried to stay busy. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, repotted plants, organized books alphabetically, anything to keep my hands and my mind occupied. But in every quiet moment, the same question came back, relentless. What if he doesn't call? What if he chooses the money, the status, her family, over me? The thought of losing Anthony for good was a physical pain, a sharp stitch in my chest that took my breath away. I had raised that boy. I had patched his scraped knees, helped him with his homework, cheered at every graduation, cried with pride when he got his architecture degree, just like his father. I was the only blood family he had left in the world, and now I had issued an ultimatum that could sever us forever. The first night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I'd backed my son into a corner with no way out. But then, the memory of the cold chair in row 15, of Kimberly's icy smile, and most of all, of Anthony's silence, reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't for revenge. It was for respect, the respect I deserved as a mother and as a human being. If he couldn't see that, then maybe I had already lost him a long time ago. Theo was my rock. He called every few hours, not to ask about the deadline, but to distract me. He told me funny stories about his early business attempts in Europe, asked my opinion on charity projects, and made me laugh, a sound I thought had gotten lost in all the tension. "They'll fold, Angela," he told me on the morning of the second day, when my hope was starting to waver. "People like the Montgomerys didn't build an empire by being sentimental. They're practical. They'll look at the numbers, at the termination penalty, at the cost of a public scandal, and they will sign." "It's not them I'm worried about, Theo," I confessed, my voice low. "It's Anthony." There was a silence on the other end. "He's your son," Theo said softly. "He loves you." Sometimes people just need a hard shock to wake up and remember who they are. His words comforted me, but the doubt lingered. The hours crawled by. 24 hours left, 12 hours, 6 hours. With every passing hour, my stomach twisted tighter. I made some chamomile tea, but the warm liquid couldn't touch the chill I felt inside. I sat in my armchair, the same spot where I used to wait for Anthony to come home from school, and I stared at the phone, silent on the end table. There were exactly 2 hours left on the 48-hour deadline when the phone finally rang. But it wasn't Anthony. It was an unknown number, a law office number. My heart leaped into my throat. I answered with a trembling hand. "Mrs. Coleman, this is Kenya Bryant." Her voice was as calm and professional as ever, but I could detect a note of something. I couldn't place it. "Yes, Kenya. Any news?" I held my breath. This was it, the moment of truth, the end game. "News, yes," she said. "I received a call from the Montgomery family's lawyer about 20 minutes ago. They've been in meetings all day." "And?" I asked, unable to wait any longer. There was a slight pause, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling on her end. "Angela," Kenya began, and her tone shifted, becoming a little softer, almost personal. "They accepted." The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, that I had to grab the arm of the chair to keep from falling. My legs went weak. "They accepted," I repeated, my voice a whisper. "Yes," Kenya confirmed. "All of it. Every single term. The new lease will be signed tomorrow morning. The first donation to the foundation will be made within 30 days, and the scholarship in your husband's name will be established for the next academic year." Tears of relief started streaming down my face. And the apology?" "Ah, yes," Kenya said, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice. "The public apology. They've confirmed it. It will be delivered by Kimberly during the opening remarks at the Potomac Foundation Charity Gala next week, in front of 200 of their closest friends and the local press." I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall. We had won. Justice, as unlikely as it had seemed, had prevailed. "Thank you, Kenya. Thank you so much," I managed to say. "I just presented the terms, Angela. It was your strength that made them sign." We hung up, and I just sat there crying silently. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of catharsis, of a battle won. But in the midst of all that relief, one piece was still missing. Anthony. He hadn't called. His family had folded, but what about him? His choice was still a mystery. The deadline I had given him wasn't about the contract. It was about us. And as I was drying my tears, my phone rang again. This time, it was him. I looked at the name Anthony glowing on the phone screen, and the relief I felt gave way to a cold knot of apprehension. I had won the battle against the Montgomerys, but the war for my relationship with my son was about to happen on this call. I let it ring one more time, taking a deep breath, gathering what strength I had left. "Hello?" I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mom? It's me." Anthony's voice was hoarse, tired. There was no anger, no panic. There was just a deep exhaustion. "I know who it is, Anthony." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "They signed," he said finally, as if confessing a crime. "Kim's family. They agreed to everything." "Kenya called me," I replied emotionlessly. "I already know." You won, Mom," he said, and there was a tone of bitterness in his voice. "This was never about winning or losing, Anthony, and you know that." He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. "I know. I called to say that, and to say that I'm sorry." The words I had longed to hear on his wedding day, the words that could have prevented all of this, finally came, but they sounded hollow, overdue. "Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked, my voice still calm. "For staying silent? For yelling at me on the phone? Or because your wife's family lost this battle?" "For everything, Mom," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm sorry for everything. I was a coward. I know that, but I don't know how to fix it." "That, son," I replied, "is something we're going to have to figure out, but not today, not over the phone." I paused. "Your wife has an engagement next week, a public apology. I'll be there, After that, we'll talk." And without waiting for a reply, I hung up. I needed that final act. I needed to see the final consequence of their arrogance, not for sadism, but for closure. The night of the Potomac Foundation Charity Gala arrived, crisp and clear. It was one of the biggest events on the Maryland social calendar, held in the same luxury hotel ballroom every year. The elite of Potomac and Washington, D.C. were all there. I didn't go alone. Theo insisted on escorting me. He arrived at my house to pick me up, looking as elegant as ever in a black tuxedo. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the dinner at Philomena with my pearl necklace. Simple, but dignified. When I walked into the ballroom on Theo's arm, a momentary hush fell, followed by a buzz of whispers. Everyone there knew. The gossip about the wedding drama and the contract war with Sterling Capital had spread like wildfire. We found our table, which, by a delicious irony of fate, was right at the front, facing the stage. From there, I could see Kimberly, Anthony, and her parents seated at the main table. Kimberly was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. She didn't touch her food. Anthony stared intently at his plate, and Dolores and Robert Montgomery wore expressions that looked like they were carved from ice. Finally, the time for speeches came. The foundation's president spoke, thanking the donors. And then he announced, "And now, I have the pleasure of inviting to the stage Mrs. Kimberly Montgomery Coleman, one of our most dedicated patrons, to say a few words." A polite applause rippled through the hall as Kimberly stood up. Her hands were shaking as she walked to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, the sound screeching for an instant. She looked out at the crowd of familiar faces, her friends, her business associates. Her face was ashen. She began reading from the text Kenya had written, her voice monotone and robotic. "Good evening, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity not just to speak about the wonderful work of this foundation, but also to make a personal acknowledgement." She stopped, swallowing hard. Her eyes found mine in the audience. For an instant, I saw a flash of pure hatred in them, before it was replaced by the mask of rehearsed remorse. "Recently," she continued, her voice trembling, "during an event that should have been one of pure joy, my own wedding, I made a grave mistake. I showed a profound and inexcusable lack of respect to a person who should be one of the most important people in my life, my mother-in-law, Angela Coleman." A murmur went through the hall. People leaned forward in their chairs, their phones discreetly starting to record. I subjected her to a humiliation that no mother, no person should ever endure. My actions were motivated by prejudice and arrogance, and there is no excuse for my behavior. I want to publicly ask for her forgiveness. Angela, I am so sorry. I disrespected you, and in doing so, I disrespected my new family and the memory of my husband's father. I hope that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me." She finished reading, her face now wet with tears that, this time, seemed genuine. Tears of humiliation. She was getting a taste of her own medicine. The silence in the hall was absolute, heavy, expectant. All 200 pairs of eyes turned to me. What did they expect? For me to yell? To humiliate her back? To savor the victory? Theo squeezed my hand gently under the table. I took a deep breath. With a calmness that surprised even me, I stood up. I took the microphone that one of the stunned organizers offered me. I walked to the stage. I stood next to Kimberly, who couldn't look me in the eye. I looked out at the crowd, at Dolores, her face tight with fury, at Robert, pale and defeated, and at Anthony, who finally lifted his head and looked at me, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored my own. "Thank you, Kimberly," I said, my clear, steady voice echoing through the hall. "I accept your apology as an acknowledgement of the truth. The truth is important. Respect is important." I paused, letting my words sink in. "As for forgiveness," I continued, looking directly at my son, "forgiveness is not a switch you can flip. It's not a contract you sign. It's a process, a path you begin to walk. And that path begins now." A stunned silence filled the hall. I handed back the microphone, turned, and walked back to my table, leaving Kimberly alone on the stage, under the weight of 200 stares and her own actions. The rest of the charity event was a blur. People came to our table, some with looks of disguised pity, others with a newfound admiration. I ignored most of them. My mind was elsewhere, processing the emotional whirlwind of the night. Theo was my shield, politely dismissing the curious and wrapping me in a bubble of tranquility. We left early, before dessert was even served. The next day, a Sunday, the house was quiet. I spent the morning in my garden, feeling the earth between my fingers, the scent of the roses calming me. I had closed the loop on the public humiliation. I had restored my dignity. But the deepest wound, the one involving my son, was still wide open. Around noon, I heard a knock on the door. Not the arrogant rapping of Dolores, but two hesitant, almost timid knocks. My heart knew who it was. I opened the door. Anthony was standing on my porch, alone. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, but jeans and a plain t-shirt. He looked younger, more vulnerable. His eyes were red and swollen, and he looked like he hadn't slept. "Mom," he began, his voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and let him pass. He walked into the living room, the place that had been the center of his world for so many years, and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. He stopped in front of the picture of him and David, taken at a baseball game years ago. "I miss him," Anthony whispered, more to the picture than to me. "Me too, son. Every single day." He turned to me, and the facade of the successful businessman finally crumbled. The tears he'd been holding back started to stream down his face. "I'm a failure, Mom," he said, his voice broken. "Dad would be so ashamed of me. I let the shininess of their world blind me. I wanted to belong so badly, wanted to be good enough for Kimberly, for her family, that I forgot who I was. I forgot where I came from." He sat down on the sofa, his head in his hands. "On the wedding day, when Kimberly said that, I heard it, Mom. Every word, and a part of me screamed. It screamed for me to say something, to defend you, to tell everyone to go to hell and stand by your side. But I couldn't. The fear of losing all of that, of going back to being just Anthony, the teacher's son. It was stronger. I stayed silent, and it was the loudest sound I've ever made in my life. It was the first time I'd seen him so broken, so honest, since David's death. I sat down next to him, not to hug him, not yet, but to listen. "I love you, Mom. I never stopped loving you. I got lost, and I don't know how to find my way back." His tears were the confession I needed. The pain on his face was the proof that my son, my boy, was still in there, buried under layers of expensive suits and ambition. I took a deep breath. The path to forgiveness, as I'd said, begins now. And it would begin with rules, with boundaries. The way back isn't a map I can give you, Anthony. It's a path you're going to have to build, I said, my voice soft but firm. If you want to fix this, if you really mean it, things are going to have to change. They can't be the way they were. He lifted his head, his eyes full of a desperate hope. "Anything, Mom. I'll do anything." "First," I said, "you're going to therapy. By yourself. You need to understand why your fear of not being accepted is greater than your self-respect and your respect for your mother. You need to find your own backbone, one that doesn't depend on the Montgomery name." He nodded without hesitation. "Okay." "Second," I continued, "we're going to have family dinners. Here, in this house, every Sunday. No excuses, no business trips, no last-minute engagements. If you want to be a part of my life, you're going to have to be present in it. And Kimberly is welcome, if she is willing to walk into this house with respect. We'll be here," he promised. "And third, and most importantly," I said, looking him in the eye, "you will never, ever again stay silent when someone disrespects me. I don't care if it's your wife, your mother-in-law, or the President of the United States. I am your mother, and I demand your respect. If you can't give me that, then we have nothing left to talk about." He reached out and took my hand. His hand was cold, but his grip was firm. "I promise, Mom, I will never stay silent again. I swear on Dad's memory." We sat in silence for a long time, just feeling the weight of that promise. The first brick on the path back had been laid. Weeks later, the first Sunday dinner happened. Anthony and Kimberly arrived on time. Kimberly was quiet, humbled. She brought me a pot of orchids and apologized again, this time in private, in my kitchen. Her voice was low, and the apology seemed sincere. I accepted it. The process, after all, had to start somewhere. We sat at the table, the same table where Anthony did his homework for so many years. I made his favorite meal, roasted chicken and potatoes. It was an awkward dinner, full of pauses and silences, but they weren't hostile silences. They were silences of rebuilding, of people trying to find a new way to be together. In the middle of dinner, Anthony stood up and went to the dining room. He came back with a chair and placed it next to him at the head of the table. The chair remained empty. Then he went out to the garden and came back with a single white rose, one of David's roses, and placed it on the seat of the chair. I looked at him, confused. He smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "It's for Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So he knows we're trying to fix things, and so he'll always have a place at this table." In that moment, looking at the empty chair with the white rose, I knew. My boy, my Anthony, was finally finding his way back home. The Sunday dinners became a sacred ritual. Each week, another layer of ice melted. Anthony talked more, not about work, but about life. He told me about his challenges in therapy, about the childhood memories he was rediscovering. Kimberly, in turn, was changing. The arrogance gave way to a cautious curiosity. She started asking me about my years as a teacher, about the books I loved, about my family's history. Slowly, painfully, we were becoming a real family, not a collision of two worlds. The empty chair with the white rose was always there, a silent reminder of the foundation we were rebuilding on: love, loss, and the promise of respect. My life, which had seemed to shrink and turn gray after David's death, suddenly burst into color. Theo and I started our project. We found a small, neglected space in a public library in Anacostia, not far from where I used to teach. With his resources and my knowledge of the community, we transformed the place. We painted the walls bright colors, bought comfortable beanbag chairs, and filled the shelves with donated and new books. The David and Angela Reading Corner opened on a sunny Saturday morning. Seeing the faces of the children, their eyes lighting up as they opened a new book, brought me a joy I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Theo was a constant, warm presence. He didn't try to replace David. Instead, he honored his memory, listening to my stories, looking at the old photos, helping me tend to the roses in the garden. He fit into my life so naturally, so easily, it felt like he had always been there, just waiting in the next room. One evening, as we were sipping wine on my porch, the same porch where he had said goodbye to me 51 years ago, he took my hand. "I have a business trip to Tuscany in 2 weeks," he said, his blue eyes sparkling under the dim porch light. "I'm visiting some vineyards my company is thinking of investing in, but the truth is, I don't want to go alone. I want to show you Florence, Angela. I want to walk with you across the Ponte Vecchio, eat gelato in the piazza, and watch you smile in the Tuscan sun." He paused. "Come with me." The invitation took my breath away. Me, Angela Coleman, the retired school teacher from D.C. In Tuscany? It felt like something out of one of the novels I loved so much. The old Angela, the row 15 Angela, would have hesitated. She would have worried about the cost, the complications, what people would say. But this new Angela, the woman who tore up a $60,000 check and faced down the Potomac elite, just smiled. "I would love that, Theo." And now, here I am, in my bedroom, my suitcase open on the bed. The plane ticket to Florence is on my dresser, next to my old copy of Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman. The morning sun is streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I look at my reflection in the wardrobe mirror. The woman looking back at me has more wrinkles than I'd care to admit. Her hair has more silver than brown. But her eyes are sparkling. She doesn't look like the woman who sat in that cold chair, feeling invisible. She looks like a woman who is about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. My journey has been a painful one. I was pushed to the back row, not just at a wedding, but in my own life. For years, I accepted my place in the background, living in the shadows of my husband's memory, my son's expectations, and the contempt of a world I never belonged to. But the humiliation of that day didn't break me. It forged me. I walked out of row 15 and onto the center stage of my own life. And the most important part is that I wasn't carried there. I walked on my own 2 feet. I walked with pain, with anger, with resolve, and with the unshakable conviction that my dignity was not and would never be negotiable. The future, which once looked like a lonely and frightening road, now opens up before me, vast and promising, as warm as the first spring morning after a long, hard winter. I'm ready to live in the front row of my own life. Today, 2 years after that wedding, I live in Washington, D.C., but my passport has stamps from Italy, France, and Spain. Theo and I travel the world, but we always come home, to my little house with the rose garden. Anthony and Kimberly are trying for a baby. They come to dinner every Sunday. Kimberly and I have even started a small book club. They lost the respect of many of their wealthy friends, but they gained something far more valuable: a family. Dolores and Robert Montgomery? They still have their company, paying their rent on time and funding the scholarship that has already sent 2 bright young kids to architecture school. They've never tried to speak to me again. I've learned that family isn't just about the blood we share, but about the respect we offer. I've learned that it's never too late to claim your worth, to rewrite your own story. And I've learned that sometimes true love isn't the kind that burns hot and fast, but the kind that has the patience to wait 51 years to find you again in the back row and invite you to sit up front. So, what would you have done in my place? Do you think I did the right thing? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what city you're listening from. If you enjoyed my story, please give this video a like. It really helps me to keep sharing stories like this one. Thank you so much for your kindness. You'll see a couple of other stories on the screen now that I think you'll love. So go ahead and click on one of those to watch next. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe. Until the next story.